Okay. I'll just get like a camelback. All right, this is on? Okay. All right, welcome back. It's good to see more faces and more of your faces. All right, last week, I'm sorry, we should open in prayer. If somebody could open us up in prayer. Should get one of them too. All right. 2 weeks ago, we saw that some Corinthians were utilizing, or at least contemplating, utilizing prostitutes. And I argued that the best scenario for this would have been at a Corinthian banquet, one probably held at a pagan temple. Pagan temples were sometimes rented out to throw a party. Very few Roman homes could accommodate a very large group. Pagan temples thus served double as, I guess, what we would call reception halls. And at such a banquet, after the feasting, usually involving meat sacrificed to idols, a brothel keeper might drag in his prostitute slaves for sale. Some Corinthian Christians may have felt, and perhaps rightly, that in the eyes of their pagan neighbors, abstaining would look odd. I mean, this was Corinth. After all, Corinth was very Roman, and when in Rome, next slide. And so, some Corinthians were justifying their behavior by claiming that it mattered little what they do with their bodies. And this was characteristic of much Greek and Roman hedonistic thought. Right? The soul is immortal, that's what matters. The body is transitory. It matters less what you do with the body, and especially those very, very bodily activities like sex mattered little. Paul, however, is thoroughly Jewish in his philosophy. The body, lost my place. Sorry. The body, there it is, will be raised. And that notion is neither Greek or Roman. Paul is also thoroughly Christian. For even now, the Christian's body is uniquely, and we'll have to say and settle for, mysteriously related to Christ's resurrected body. At times, Paul talks about our resurrection in the future tense, right? You will be raised. And that makes the most sense to us. It seems clear that this hasn't happened yet. But at other times, and in the next slide, there you go, that's the one. No, I missed a slide. At other times, Paul speaks as if it's already happened. And this is a mystery. At any point, I made the argument, and we should be on slide 5, I believe. That's the argument. And dismissed. There we go. I made the argument that Paul was being quite literal when he called the Corinthians that they are the bodies, members of Christ, and literally that is body parts of Christ himself. And this is a mystery of mysteries. The main point, though, is that what they do with their bodies has significance beyond their own little walking islands. They are not single stars, they belong to a constellation. So much for a couple weeks ago. We're beginning today chapter 7. In the next several chapters, Paul addresses concerns raised by the Corinthians themselves in the letter they had given him. That is, up until now, he seems to have been addressing issues he learned orally and probably from the deliverers of their letter. Next slide. just to remind us where all this is coming from. So the Corinthians had questions for Paul. They send a letter in the hands of Chloe's people. But along with the contents of that letter, Paul learns of certain things that perhaps they did not think he needed to know, or perhaps they didn't want him to know. And we have dealt with that up until now. Factions, lawsuits, prostitutes, an incestuous man having an affair with, and I always get this wrong, his I always want to say mother-in-law, I don't know, stepmother. Thank you. All right. At this point, we reach a major division in this letter. Paul now starts to tackle their issues. And in the next chapter, chapter 7, we see Paul at his most practical. There's very little heady theology and a lot of just simple counseling. Usually I like to call him Paul the paradoxical theologian. And here he's simply Paul the pastor. Now, chapter 7 constitutes a single unit, but 34 verses are way too much to cover in a single sitting, especially given the tendencies of your Sunday school teacher. So this means we will be breaking it up, and sometimes a little arbitrarily. We'll simply call time and then pick it up where we left off. All right, slide 7, just to give you the context, marriage and sex. And then slide 8. Now, for the matters you wrote about, it is good for a man not to marry, but since there is so much immorality, each man should have his own wife, and each woman her own husband. The husband should fulfill his marital duty to his wife, and likewise the wife to her husband. The wife's body does not belong to her alone, but also to her husband. And in the same way, the husband's body does not belong to him alone, but also to his wife. Do not deprive each other except by mutual consent and for a time, so that you may devote yourself to prayer. Then come together again, so that Satan will not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. I say this as a concession, not as a command. I wish that all men were as I am, but each man has his own gift from God. One has this gift, and another has that. All right. Let us begin, and as often, we begin with a matter of translation confronting us. I'm read from the NIV, and it begins now, for the matters you wrote about, it is good for a man not to marry. Next slide. On your left is the NIV, and you'll see that the NIS has something quite different. The NAS on your right is literal. That is what the Greek literally says. Now, it's clearly a euphemism, to touch, a metaphor, which means you have to interpret what is it a metaphor for. The NIV has interpreted this as marrying, and that is almost certainly wrong. We have no evidence that this was a metaphor for marriage. It was, however, a metaphor or euphemism for sex. And this led some older scholars to propose that what we are dealing with are Corinthians who were proposing complete abstinence even within marriage. These scholars pictured our Corinthians as, eschatological zealots, right? I mean, having learned from Paul and other apostles that sex and marriage plays no part in the future kingdom, some were getting a head start. This older view has rightly, I think, fallen into disfavor. It would make them very, very unusual Corinthians. to take this position. Excessive asceticism? I mean, really? If we have gathered anything about them, they are all too Corinthian. Obsessed with status, litigious, lecherous. These are not the traits of excessively ascetic Christians, but of typical Corinthians. So is there a more common background, something that we can bring our Corinthians down to planet Earth, specifically planet Corinth? And yes, linguistic studies, just studies in language, have shown that the euphemism touch meant sexual gratification. Oh, Martha, you're fine. Comic relief, that's good. Yeah, I know, right? And it was an awkward thing for me to say, too, so now I have to go through. Yeah, so this is all about sex. So linguistic studies have shown that the euphemism touch meant sexual gratification. Sex for the simple pleasure of sex. No children in view, okay? I'm going to call it recreational sex. I'm starting to sweat, too, now. There's a reason, if anybody needs a refill. Now, for us, the notion that married couples can have sex without children in view is not going to be very novel. In fact, apart from Catholics, many prevent procreation, at least during those honeymoon years, right? They want to travel, and then later they'll lay down roots. But sex with your wife, apart from producing children, would have been novel to our Corinthians. And, well, perhaps the best way to get this across is to give something concrete, so I'm going to bring back an old friend. Hello, my name is Cornelius, and I am a Corinthian. Now, before I met Paul, I would have had sex with my wife, but only for the purpose of producing legitimate children. When the urge was upon me, I would have satiated it with my female slaves and, as I brought up last week, my slave boys. Put less delicately, or with prostitutes, but that costs money. Put less delicately, I would periodically have sex with my wife at opportune times, and I will more frequently touch my slaves or prostitutes. You see the distinction? But then this Paul guy came along with a number of major changes in my daily routine. He made it clear that I can't have sex with my slaves or with prostitutes. I can only have sex with my wife. But when? Just to produce children? That is, well, rather tough. I am, after all, a red-blooded Corinthian. So I decided that if I can't satisfy my urges with anyone but my wife, I guess my wife and I will be having more sex. Boys will be boys. We'll see if attendance is like twice the amount after this one. Boys will be boys, and a few weeks ago I was at the bathhouse talking to Lucretius and Quintilius, who are also Christians, and I mentioned this newfound conjugal freedom. And this made them uncomfortable. Yes, this is what made them uncomfortable. Not prostitutes, not litigations or factions. Now, I understand their discomfort. This is not very Roman. In fact, they challenged me to cite a single Greek or Roman philosopher who recommended such egregious conjugal freedom. And truth be told, I could not. I mean, there are some philosophers who advocated total abstinence outside of procreative sex with one's wife, right? I mean, there were some Stoic philosophers who would have disapproved of my previous employment of prostitutes or engagement with slaves. Periodic sex with my wife to continue the family name is all they advised. And there were some philosophers who reluctantly allowed that boys, well, will be boys, and we will seek sexual gratification outside of marriage, but they recommended restraint. But I could come up with no example of a philosopher who recommended frequent sex with my wife simply for the enjoyment of it. None thought it appropriate, again, to bring back this euphemism, none thought it appropriate that I touch my wife. My friends, Lucretius and Quintilius, went so far as to infer from this philosophical consensus that by this newfound sexual freedom within marriage, I might even be dishonoring her. She is, after all, a Roman matron, not some slave to be degraded by my sudden impulses. They thus counseled me to have sex with my wife for the respectable purpose of procreation, but no more. In other words, I'm having a hard time finding words that are not triggering. I must not touch her, but I can have sex with her. You see the distinction? I hope so. I don't want to make it any clearer. And so, Paul, I want to know your thoughts on this. Can I touch my wife, or is sex only for procreation? And so we turn to Paul's thoughts. Next slide. Yeah. We don't have it, but yes, he is answering questions that they. Oh, no, I'm sorry. I'm Cornelius. That was just an illustration. That was just an. No, I'm so sorry. No. That's good. Yes. Yes, that was an illustration, total fiction, with some historical plausibility. All right, where are we? Slide 10, I believe. So I've had to alter the Greek a little bit in my translation. Now for the matters you wrote about, it is good for a man not to touch a wife, that is, to have sex with his wife, except for procreation. All right. It is not Paul's intention to overly regulate marital sex. And this is interesting given some rabbinic thoughts, which he might have learned in his days as a Pharisee. I think I have a slide, just giving some background. Next slide. So this is from the Mishnah. You want some laughs? The Mishnah is a hoot. There's some good Jewish comedy in it. All right. Next slide. Slide 11. No, slide 12. Paul counsels in verse 2, since there is so much sexual immorality, and anything where you see italics now is something that my interpretation or translation, it's not just immorality, it's sexual immorality. But since there is so much sexual immorality, each man should have his own wife and each woman her own husband. And even there, the verb for have there means to maintain sexual regularity. It's not to have a status as married. He's not counseling people to get married. He's saying have regular sex with your spouses. And it's interesting that sex here, which in our modern day is just lauded as the chief pleasure, a major ingredient in a fulfilled life, he treats it as a prophylactic. Have sex with your spouses so you don't have sex with anybody else. This makes him a rather unusual Jew. Procreation simply has lost its importance in the new creation. All right. Paul thus commands husbands and wives to fulfill their marital obligations to one another. And this obligation results from the unique relationship established in marriage and through sex. A number of weeks ago, we looked at the concept of sex as a covenantal act. In all covenants of the Old Testament, there is a verbal agreement, and that is consummated by some sort of physical gesture, often sacrifice, or the promises made to Abraham were consummated in the act of circumcision, right? A physical gesture. And sex is the physical consummation of the marriage vows. And because they are one flesh, the possession they have over their own bodies seems to cover the other. All right, we're looking at verse 4. The wife's body does not belong to her alone, but also to her husband. In the same way, the husband's body does not belong to him alone, but also to his wife. I have to add, too, I kind of alluded to it a couple of weeks ago and never really got to develop it. In fact, I don't even know if I mentioned it at all. But this language of having possession of the other body, it's very similar to language that we met back in 1 Corinthians 6:12. Let's look at that. Slide 13. On your left, 1 Corinthians 6:12, everything is permissible for me, but not everything is beneficial. Everything is permissible for me, but I will not be mastered by anything. That language right there, underlined, I will not be mastered by anything, is pretty close to the Greek of verse 4 on the right. And to make that clearer, I'll give my translation in slide 14. Now, Paul tells the Corinthians, he challenges their slogan claiming autonomy, and he challenges it by saying, yes, but I will not be mastered by anything. He doesn't clarify what that is. We're left to speculate. And in that context, it could simply be that by claiming absolute autonomy, they therefore become slaves. There's an irony there. But you indulge the senses long enough and eventually become a slave of the senses, right? It becomes a sort of addictive power over you. That probably is the case. However, I have to propose a possibility that what Paul has in mind is what happens in sex, that a unique relationship is being established between a Corinthian and a prostitute when engaging in it. I'm having a hard time really developing it, so if I'm losing you, we'll move on soon. But I don't know. The wife does not have mastery over her own body, but rather the husband does, and likewise the husband does not have mastery over his own body, but rather the wife does. Clearly, something is happening in marriage and through sex, and it is just possible that Paul is warning the Corinthians when they were thinking about engaging prostitutes that there is something happening there. He doesn't explain, but this is not just, there's no such thing for Paul as casual sex. Let's put it that way. All right. Next slide. Verse 5. Do not deprive one another. Paul allows times of brief abstinence for the purpose of prayer. Why might such times be necessary? Sexual abstinence is a form of fasting, and for Paul, fasting would have been in times of crises. Pharisees fasted on Mondays and Thursdays, probably because Israel had been in a crisis since the days of Solomon. That was the last time they were completely free of foreign oppression. And thus it seems that is why fasting, regular fasting developed in between the testaments, right? We really don't hear a lot about fasting in the Old Testament, and suddenly everybody's fasting in the New Testament. Thus, our Corinthians might be considering fasting from sex. Why? It could be anything. Business is not going well. Sickness, having trouble conceiving children. That would be rather ironic, the use of fasting from sex. However, there might be another thing. Another reason. Slide 17. There we go. Later on, Paul is going to talk about the present crisis. I think that it is good for you to remain as you are. And in a week or two, I'm going to argue that right now, while Paul is writing this letter, Corinth is suffering from a huge famine. And it's going to be a lot of fun to show how historians gather this information. But it could be that they devote themselves to prayer because times are hard, and fasting from sex. Well, I don't know. I've never done it. Or rather, I've done it all my life. Sorry, I'm completely losing my place here. You realize how many times you've just said the word sex and procreation and recreational sex, and suddenly, all eyes are on you. And more faces than I'm used to seeing, so. All right. These, next slide, 18, slide 18. Verse 5, these periods of abstinence are to be periodic, all right? Paul tells them, then come together again, and that simply means to resume sexual activity. Come together again, lest Satan tempt you, because you lack self-control. He says, I say this as a concession, not as a command. The concession, all right, is actually for these periodic phases of abstinence. All right, for Paul, if you are a regular hot-blooded Corinthian, regular sex is necessary so that you don't have illegitimate sex. All right. Verse, any questions? Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Yeah.
I wanted to go back. You have to think about the one flesh. But that goes back to Genesis. I mean, that's when God created man and woman. They were to be one flesh, and that's the. So I don't think that's any concession to the. Because these are Corinthians, they weren't Jewish people, and I don't know. But that's what we have in marriage. We have marriage that verse is frequently quoted. And so that's a different approach. That this is not just so that you do not want to, I mean, he's arguing Corinthians from where you're standing. But on the other hand, from a biblical standpoint, sex is what God created and intended in marriage.
Yeah.
Going back to Genesis.
I'm not sure. I'm missing the question or.
Well, before you were talking about, he was talking about, I have to go back.
Yeah, okay. Let's go back.
He had that in Corinthians. He actually quoted Genesis.
Yeah.
At the end of Corinthians.
Slide 13 maybe is.
So it's not just in the same way a husband and body. Do not know that he who unites himself with prostitute is one with the body, who is said the two become one flesh. So it's more than just that you're not going to be want to have. Take the whole biblical concept. It isn't just that you are going to have sex so you're not tempted to have it. He's making that argument in Corinthians. But if you look at the whole scripture, this is God's intention for husband and wife to have sex. Going back to marriage, not just so you're not going with a prostitute or with somebody else. It's
Yeah, well, I'm not sure I'm quite tracking, but let's imagine a scenario in which a couple that are married, it's going to be very hard for us to imagine, but a couple that are married have decided, and they're completely satisfied with abstinence. Is that, and you would argue that they should not remain abstinent? Okay, we'll talk about it afterwards.
It's this idea of it isn't sex just so you're not tempted. This is what he's arguing in Corinthians.
He's arguing that to the Corinthians, absolutely.
Looking at it in terms of the whole scripture.
Yeah, then the mandate is from God to be engaged in marriage and to have oneness, physically as well as spiritually, emotionally. That's what I hear from this comment. And
Sure.
that this is a unique, that the Corinthians aren't digesting that
Yeah. So the situation that Paul's addressing is that you have some Corinthians that are only having sex for the purpose of procreation. And this is leaving some of them in a tough spot. They have urges. And some Corinthians are uncomfortable that their brothers and sisters are finding this new conjugal freedom because they think it's disrespectful. It's countercultural, basically. And Paul is basically, so maybe I made it too complicated, and Paul is saying, no, you can have sex without the purpose of procreation. I'm not saying that they're not supposed to procreate, I'm just saying that it doesn't have to be periodic. It could be frequent, like have sex. Children are going to result. I mean, there are no contraceptions. So children are going to result, but you don't have to fast from it with each other. Yeah. Yeah, that's Norm.
I think what Norm was saying is that God's command that men and women, that husbands and wives have sex and be joined in one flesh is primordial. It's part of the very beginning of his design.
Yeah.
Not just so we won't stray.
Is that true in the New Testament?
Well, that's what it seems like Paul's communicating right here.
At least to the Corinthians, he's saying, you do this so that you don't stray, so that Satan doesn't.
Yeah, but the commandment to get married and fulfill and populate the earth, that is an Old Testament commandment. That has been supplanted by the gospel. I often think that Matthew intends the Great Commission. I'm not saying that you're not allowed to, certainly, but the emphasis, new creation, old creation is populated by old creation methods, fulfilling the primordial commandment. New creation is populated by new creation methods, preaching the gospel, and the Spirit creates new people. Yeah.
I think there's something, I think there's something holy when two people become one flesh before God in the marriage ceremony. It's a commitment before God, and to stray outside of that is an affront to God.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Because, he's saying if you go with a prostitute, you're doing the same thing with someone you're not committed to or love. And so this is an affront to God on many levels.
Yeah, and we talked about a few weeks ago about sex being a covenantal act, and Paul says that of all the sins, sexual immorality is the one sin against the body. Right? It was a very cryptic statement, and I argue that it's because it involves the body in a covenantal lie. Other addictions, which are equally bad for the body, right, indulging in alcohol, these are not sins against the body because they are not covenantal acts. They can be used in covenantal acts like the Lord's Supper, but they are not intrinsically a covenantal act, whereas sex is intrinsically a covenantal act. So in sexual immorality, you are involving the body in a lie, which is all the more serious for Christians and the Corinthians because now the body is the temple of the Holy Spirit. Yeah. But let's remember, Paul's single, and he wishes everybody were single. So, yes, it did. Paul wishes everybody was single. And so let's bring that back. So you have to keep that in mind for all that we glorify marriage and sex. The New Testament does not lay the same emphasis on it that the Old Testament does. So remember, Jesus was single. John the Baptist was probably single. All right. Let's go to slide 18. Verse 7, there it is. I wish that all men were as I am, but each man has his own gift from God, and one has this gift and another has that. When he says, we'll learn in the next couple verses next week, when he says, I wish that all men were as I am, he means all were single. But he does make it very clear that that is a gift from God. And I would say when he uses this language of gift, it is a gift of the Spirit. It is also, the gift is not singleness. The gift is not singleness. The gift is to be contented with singleness. Clearly, because he's saying, if you can't control yourself, i.e. you're not content being single, then get married. I do wonder if we sometimes forget about people that are single and are going to be single probably for the rest of their lives. You know, we might often think that they're the odd man or woman out, but in what sense? They're just ahead of the times, right? Because there's not going to be a marriage in heaven. We'll be married to Christ. Turns out that, well, all you people are the odd people out. You're behind the times. That's a message that I don't actually ever really hear when addressing singleness, and I'd like it to be. Maybe we should hear it more often. It's coming up. Yeah, it's coming up. That'll be next week. All right. So it is a gift of the Spirit, singleness, and that is contented singleness. What about Paul? We don't know anything about Paul's marital history. The only thing we know is that right now, while writing this letter, he is single. He could be just a bachelor, a long-life bachelor. He could also be a widower or a divorcee. Divorce was very high, and in his Pharisaic days, he may have been married and divorced several times. We don't know. Were you about to say something, Mom?
Did I read somewhere that both Pharisees, that was part of it, they had to be married?
Yeah, almost all rabbis. It's very difficult in Jewish studies to know what background we're allowed to use from Jewish writings to help us understand the New Testament, because all of it, almost all our Jewish writings come from the year 200 AD. And so to just open up like the Mishnah, which is a Jewish law book, and say, oh, look at that, this makes me think of what Jesus says here, that law that they're writing about could have been invented in 150 AD, which is well ahead of Jesus' time. So it's hard sometimes to say, at this point, all Pharisees would have married, because we're learning that from something that was finally put down into writing in 200 AD. However, given the primordial commandment, I think that yes, it was generally expected that all Jews would get married and produce children, which makes the New Testament, which makes Paul rather radical. It doesn't say anywhere in here about procreation. All right. I'll conclude with 2 points. The first is that this passage is extremely countercultural. When our Corinthians, especially our male Corinthians, like Cornelius, heard the first half of verse 4 read aloud to them, they would simply have concurred. They would have been shocked at hearing the second half. All right? I am Cornelius, I am a male, masculinity is autonomy. That my wife has ownership of my body, that is very, very odd. Not only that in verse 5, abstinence is supposed to be by mutual consent, that my wife would have a say in our sex life, very countercultural. It's impossible to turn Paul into a modern feminist, but his reputation among some modern theologians as just a misogynist is undeserved. Paul is far too complex to be squeezed into any box like that. My second point is that I'm going to emphasize where Paul's emphasis lies in his instructions to wives and husbands. He does not say husbands should expect love from their wives or wives should expect love from their husbands. The imperative is to give love, right? The imperative is other-oriented. Husbands are to think less about what their wives owe them than on what they owe their wives, and vice versa. All right. Any questions? Yeah.
Do you think one of the reasons he encouraged people to be single was he expecting the second coming of Christ?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it troubles a lot of people. I think it mainly troubles a lot of people because, well, if so, he was wrong, and how could Paul, who writes Scripture, be wrong? It says more about what we think Scripture should be. And so, yeah, in his writings, I think, at least certainly in his earliest letters, I think he was expecting Jesus to return in his lifetime. In his later writings, we see especially when he's in prison and about to face death, probably, I think he's finally grasped the fact that, okay, he might not live to see the return. But also, I think he has eschatology on his mind. As I said, he knows that in new creation, marriage and sex are replaced by union with Christ, and he wants people to anticipate that time, but he knows that that's not the gift for everybody. Yeah. All right. Seems like we got no more questions. If somebody could close prayer. All right.
Heavenly Father, thank you so much for giving us this opportunity to look at your word very, very closely and to understand better what Paul had in mind when he wrote this letter to the Corinthians. We thank you for Connor's scholarship, for his study, and for the way he's able to make some of these more difficult and complex thoughts clearer for us. We thank you that we live in this place where we can come to Sunday school and church where we continue to pray for Ukraine and the crisis. We ask that you do everything. In Jesus' name.
Amen. All right, I'll see you guys next week, or we're off a week? Potluck. I'll see you at potluck. All right. Of course.